Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am super excited that you are joining us tonight for Left Bank Books welcomes National Book Award-winning cartoonist Nate Powell, who will discuss his new book, Save It for Later: Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. Powell will be in conversation with Left Bank Books, myself, Cliff Helm, and Jim Mosley. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. We would like to thank our supporters, the supporters of Nate Powell, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. We offer curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. We are incredibly excited to announce that we are reopening to the public, and you will be able to come in and browse again. The first day for that is Independent Bookstore Day in just a couple of weekends. We are also incredibly happy to be able to bring our event series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope that you enjoy this event, and we hope that you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a signed copy for you or for all of your friends at left-bank.com. It is a beautiful signed edition. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating. It also allows us to keep this event series going. So thank you for your support. I am Shane Mullen. I'm the events coordinator for Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. Cliff and Jim very much included in that fantastic team. We will be taking questions from you, the audience, throughout the event. Because we are producing and moderating the event ourselves, feel free to type a question at any point in time throughout the event, and we will weave it into the conversation. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook to be notified about all of our fantastic virtual events. We have so many incredible events already lined up for the year and are adding events daily. 2 added today. About Save It for Later. Hold up the book. By the award-winning graphic novelist of the March trilogy by John Lewis and Andrew Aden, a collection of graphic nonfiction essays about living in a new era of necessary protest. In this anthology of 7 comics essays, author and graphic novelist Nate Powell addresses living in an era of what he calls necessary protest. Save It for Later: Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest is Powell's reflection on witnessing the collapse of discourse in real time while drawing the award-winning trilogy March, written by Congressman John Lewis and Andrew Aden. This generation's preeminent historical account of nonviolent revolution in the civil rights movement. Powell highlights both the danger of normalized paramilitary presence symbols in consumer pop culture and the roles we play individually as we interact with our communities, families, and society at large. Each essay tracks Powell's journey from the night of the election, promising his 4-year-old daughter that Trump will never win, to the reality of the Republican presidency, protesting the administration's policies and navigating the complications of teaching his children how to raise their own voices in a world that is becoming increasingly dangerous and more polarized. While 6 of the 7 essays are new unpublished work, Powell has also included About Face, a comics essay first published by Popula Online that swiftly went viral and inspired him to expand his work on Save It for Later. The 7th and final essay will contextualize the myriad events of 2020 with the previous 4 years, from the COVID-19 pandemic to global protests in the wake of George Floyd's murder to the 2020 presidential election itself, highlighting both the consistencies and inversions of widely shared experiences and observations amidst a massive social upheaval. As Powell moves between subjective and objective experiences, raising his children, depicted in their childhood innocence as imaginary anthropomorphic animals, he reveals the electrifying sense of trust and connection with his neighbors and strangers in protest. He also explores how to equip young people with tools to best make their own noise as they grow up and help shape the direction and future of this country. About tonight's speaker. Nate Powell is a National Book Award-winning cartoonist whose work includes civil rights icon John Lewis's historic March trilogy, Come Again, Too Dead, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole, and the silence of our friends. Powell has also received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, 3 Eisner Awards, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Comic-Con International Inkpot Award, 2 Ignatz Awards, and the Walter Dean Myers Award. He's discussed his work at the United Nations, on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, PBS, CNN, and Free Speech TV. He lives in Bloomington, Indiana, and you can visit him online at seemybrotherdance.org. And now, without further ado, I would like to welcome Cliff and Jim to help me warmly welcome Nate Powell to the event. If everyone at home and if Cliff and Jim would help me with a large round of applause as we welcome the fabulous Nate Powell.
Welcome.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Glad to be here, y'all. How's everybody feeling?
Good.
Not bad.
Right on.
Excellent.
We are all such huge fans of your work. Every time that your name comes up at the bookstore, it is a basic just everyone gathering and stopping work. So it's really fantastic to have this event happen tonight so that we can have it be a part of our work.
That means a lot to me. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, and I especially would proselytize about you need to read About Face to people, just staff in general, just oh, have you read it? You need to read it. It's very important. You need to read this.
Thank you. I'm not really a webcomics person, and I mostly do long form comics, both fiction and nonfiction. And About Face was a really strange choice in terms of the period of time I spent on it, but also its ultimate avenue for publication. So I drew it traditionally formatted for print, and it was mostly a series of observations that had really been crystallizing over 2016 and 2017 in terms of symbols and signifiers, that are associated with white supremacy and paramilitary presence, but also just sort of the trickle down from military to paramilitary to law enforcement, and then just kind of boiled into a mushy pop culture stew of consumer goods. But the entire time what motivated me to make About Face was simply the fact that every single day going through my town, just taking my kids back and forth to school and going to the grocery store, I kept seeing these very clear trends emerging over the course of about a year and a half, in terms of bumper sticker culture, but also in terms of late model automobile purchases and detailing jobs. And I'm not really interested in those things, frankly. I couldn't help but notice this very obvious shift. And by the end of 2017, I was like, well, I know that this isn't just in my head. This seems very obvious to me. However, I don't see anyone or read about a piece that anyone has done yet that is making these connections, especially in a kind of a decades-long way, in the way that I'm processing them. So a few months later, I was like, well, looks like I'm just going to have to organize my thoughts on paper.
The change you want to see.
Yes,
Yeah.
precisely. I mean, that's a good motivator for a lot of the comics I do. And I had no concept of what the output or the final venue of publication was going to be. But by the time it was done, I had kind of, on a formal level, I had painted myself into a corner because I had drawn it in a specific way that would be read best in print. But I had only recently become more acquired with a lot of really excellent current topical cartooning that's done. I guess the most visible outlet being thenib.com. And a lot of it is smartly formatted for phones and tablets, and it's a much more natural choice than how I had executed About Face. And I wound up having, a somewhat difficult time finding a home for it. And I was a day away from just publishing it on Gumroad or something, and maybe 50 people will read it. But fortunately, my cartoonist friend had just gone in on starting up a new independent publishing venture, Popula.com, and she offered to publish it on the spot. And I was mostly just relieved that it would at least have a home and that I wouldn't be ruining its published life by attempting to put it online myself. So I was very pleasantly surprised and vindicated that people responded to it and in the way they did, and really brought affirmation that these observations and patterns and trends weren't something that was just rattling around in my brain. Comics take a long time to do, and so there's plenty of time to doubt yourself and to second guess every single thing you do.
Is doing so, because it does take a long time to do these, did you find yourself keeping like a diary to journal your experiences before they became a full-fledged essay for the book?
I'd say that about 2 months prior to actually starting to break down and draw the comic, that's when I moved from strictly a set of observations in my head, occasionally notes on my phone, but just like sentence fragments and details. Yes, then I move over to a sketchbook stage, but I don't really do a lot of like drawing in my sketchbook. It really is a place for organizing thoughts into sequence and visually noticing the patterns that I'm going to turn into visuals. But it's basically just full of writing, and this is where, as a cartoonist, my storytelling, in my opinion, is much more natural on my art side than it is on my writing side. And so it makes sense to me that my sketchbooks are devoid of drawings. That comes much more automatically and freely. And so it's just a lot of meticulous and hurried, furious notes to self.
Yeah, I think with sketching, it's always very much like, I have this idea, I need to get it out, and it's not going to be pretty necessarily, but this is what I'm going to do so that later I can go in and refine it.
Oh, without a doubt. And that's part of the joy of comics is that maybe 80% of the work is invisible to a reader or someone on the other side of publication. In general, to go from general to specific saves so much time at each step along the process. It's so much easier to recognize errors in thought or practical considerations that don't work out that early on in the game than to attempt to work out these issues on the page and have to waste a day or two of your life redrawing something.
And especially with comics, there's that aspect of all of that invisible work that you're talking about, where you're producing something that somebody can read pretty quick, and you put so much time and effort, and it's all about, you want to get it right so that it resonates with someone. Without a doubt,
that's something that's kind of haunting every time I have a book that comes out. Is there's the enjoyment that even the creator gets just by getting to like touch the paper and read their own book. But then there's always the realization where you're like, oh, I spent 2.5 years working on this and I just finished it in an hour. Like, cool.
But that makes them great for rereading.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I'll say. I've seen my son go finish a book and then immediately turn it over and start it again. And
that's a personal goal, and a lot of the fiction work I do is I've always been a fan of open-ended stories and of ambiguous endings. Though the older I get, I feel like I've gained a certain concreteness and clarity that I definitely did not have for my first couple of graphic novels. But as I've tightened things up a bit, my aim is still to basically hit that level of just enough sweet dissatisfaction that would compel me to start any book or any movie over again as well.
Yeah, the comics process. Wow.
It's a weird world, weird choice. Yeah. It's what I've wanted to do since I was 12, and I never looked back. I'm glad that I've been able to kind of hustle along and make things work out and produce, produce something that fits with what I really want to express and what's important to me. But a highly specific life choice that I don't know, involves just a lot of like being really comfortable with just like being a true homebody.
So who were some of your what were some of your early comic loves, like artists and titles? I saw a little X-Men drop in the book, and that was one of my entry points, but I was kind of curious to know who some of your artistic influences were.
You bet. I'd say that, okay, so I was born in 78. I'm from Arkansas. And so it's important to stress that pre-internet Arkansas, I really had no concept until I left Little Rock for college in 1996. Prior to 96, I had no idea really that comics existed that weren't superhero comics or, power-based adventure tales. That being said, a lot of 70s, 80s superhero artists really set the stage for how I lay out my pages, and I still angle towards them to this day. Arthur Adams, Barry Windsor Smith, Bill Sienkiewicz, John Romita Jr. And a lot of this is being moved by artists who would have been involved with the Chris Claremont run of the X-Men throughout the 70s and 80s, which really gave me a social conscience. Like thrash metal combined with Claremont's X-Men were how I gained an understanding of like racism, sexism, homophobia, nuclear war, nationalism, the way I was able to actually process these things in the world around me was like thanks to Anthrax and Wolverine.
I'm feeling seen here.
That's why I'm here. I'd say like some early exposure to still action-based, but more visible Japanese comics and cartoons that would have trickled into Arkansas in the early 90s exposed me to a broad set of options in comic storytelling, like certain transitions with panels and pages and being able to slow time down and getting a real sense of motion, of quiet, of stillness, focusing on visuals that didn't appear to have anything to do with the story, but seemed to kind of radiate some inner truth. Viewing these things as a 13 and 14-year-old who was trying to start self-publishing my own books really set off, like lights in my head. And I didn't have a vocabulary for what was going on there. But then that became my next several years of pursuit as a cartoonist, was trying to figure out what these weird transitions and different kinds of focusing in Japanese storytelling were doing and why.
Very cool.
Nate, because Jim hasn't talked about it yet, Jim is also an artist and has done comics and all that. This is actually one of his prints. And Jim, if you could just stand up a little bit. So you can
Okay, fine. I only put this on because Shane was like, you should totally wear it today. But
oh, yes.
Yeah, so I do some design stuff for the store too. But I've done some comic stuff with a group of folks here in St. Louis called Ink and Drink Comics, and we've worked on a lot of anthologies since I've had a kid. And also, you have to work and pay bills. It's been tough to keep that up, but I'm trying to do just like single piece art that's influenced by comics. So I kind of like dabbled in comics and then decided, I'm going to take what I learned from trying to hone that medium and just kind of do my own thing right now and see where I emerge from the pandemic. But for now, I'm pretty happy doing stuff for the store. Like like receiving and doing all this signage work today, and it's tiring, but it also like kind of gets the juices flowing. But like the comics background and like the thrash metal and punk rock, I'm here for it.
Score. Wait, have you ever gone to or done tabling at the St. Louis Small Press Expo?
Yes, I love the Small Press Expo. I think when I would go to a lot of the bigger conventions, like your Wizard Worlds and Planet Comic Con out in Kansas City, which I love. I love all those. But once you get to the Small Press Expos, it's this sort of intersection of comics and fine art.
Yes.
Craft, and I love that. That's like my sweet spot, because too much of the big conventions, it can just wear you down, and it's so much of like having to put on a show and a dance for an audience that may or may not be receptive to what you're doing. And especially things like Wizard World, they're there to get their pictures taken with B-list TV actors that they have nostalgia for, and that's fine. That's totally fine. Like, I'm not going to, I'm glad you're enjoying that. But it always feels, especially if you're a small press artist or writer, or you're doing your own thing, you're kind of shoved off to Artist Alley, where, and you talk people up, and I've been in retail for 20 plus years, and it feels like I'm at work where I'm like, hi, how are you doing? This is my book. This is what it's about. Whereas at the Small Press Expo, people come up to you and the conversations are just more organic.
Certainly,
you're sitting next to people. It's I don't know. It feels more like an art community versus like this corporate sponsored pop culture event in a giant domed arena. So yeah, I love the St. Louis Small Press Expo. I missed it. I missed having it last year. I'm looking forward to having it back again, because it's always a great time.
I had a really good time in 2018 when I was there too. And what you're saying really hits the nail on the head in terms of a sense of creative community that acknowledges that people are here to try to make a living, or to try to get their ideas out, or to buy books for their own enjoyment. But there's a tangible sense of community. And particularly since I'm less involved with underground punk than I was for much of my life, I've found, especially in dadhood, that the creative community aspect of the comics world has really fulfilled that need inside me for creative community. It's been really
DIY.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Yeah. Well, and it's also something that you can kind of introduce to your kids a little easier than a underground punk scene. It's like, maybe stay away from that for now. Maybe when you're much older, but right now, just look at the comics. That's fine.
We're going to talk about sarcasm, kids. Don't take it. Yeah. It cuts down on the bitterness and sarcasm level just enough that you're like, okay, 8-year-old. Yeah, you stick with me. You're going to be all right here today.
I did really love your essay about the con kind of world and the vulnerability that you had with that, because it is very easy to, for some to look at a group of people that are generally kind of pushed aside and to think like, oh, like comic effect, whatever. And comedians have been dealing with this for years, where they've been picking on communities that didn't deserve to be picked on. And now they're realizing that, like, why did we do that? Like, they have done absolutely nothing but support us for years. And we have been, like, with women or queer people or whatever the case may be, they were easy jokes to make. And I appreciated the vulnerability that you had in that essay, and also the kind of power of the essay as well, with the kind of finding someone that actually does warrant like our criticism and are not like, I don't know where I'm going with this.
I've got you covered here. Okay,
so great.
The essay Shane's talking about here is a chapter from Save It for Later called Pecking Order. And this was actually the earliest thing in Save It for Later that I had completely ironed out back in like 2013. And I don't know. So Save It for Later is divided up into really an interplay between these more subjective memoir style comics and slightly more removed, organized, objective essays. And Pecking Order is a little bit in the middle, especially as we're exploring. It's sort of a bridge essay between talking about the advancement of this, just kind of like bitter white man contrarianism that's always covered with just enough of a layer of plausible deniability, or the ability for someone to be just joking, just saying, or just asking. And then on the other side of that essay, it moves into the application through symbols and signifiers that I lay out in About Face. So yeah, in Pecking Order, I dive kind of into my experience in nerd culture. Basically, I sneak some friends into one of the bigger comic cons that has lots of like superhero cosplayers. And one thing that's weird about comics is that like even as like an indie cartoonist or graphic novelist, most of us are still people who were like weaned on super mainstream, superhero books or manga. And there's a part of us that always like we have a complicated relationship with getting shoved back into the world that we escaped from. And so there are moments where you catch yourself trying to prove that you've distanced yourself and really trying to like punch down at a certain segment of nerdhood that is not that different from what you're doing. And basically the friends who I snuck in were able to highlight the earnestness, the sincerity, and the inclusion in this cosplay world. Stuff that I had never paid attention to notice because I was so concerned with subconsciously wanting to be better than these nerds. And just as I was like basking in the wholesome, inclusive nature of these cosplayers, there's the inevitable appearance of some smug little white dude dressed up in a Nazi uniform. And so this is something that would have occurred in 2011, I believe. And it's important to note that this is in 2011. It's also important to note that I'm acting in good faith by assuming that this Nazi cosplayer in 2011 must be dressed up as like maybe a character from like a Philip K. Dick or Robert Heinlein story, like hopefully coming from some kind of speculative fiction or sci-fi context. And as I'm processing my thoughts and debating whether or not to start something with this guy and inquire whether it's worth it, someone else beats me to the punch, and getting to witness this interaction, also a very gendered interaction, basically like the smugness and the toxicity comes up. Basically I resign myself to like, this is just one idiot, right? Like, like what's the worst that could possibly happen? But it sort of sets the stage for the next chapter About Face by sort of leaving the window open for the plausible deniability of overt evil to appear, cosmetically on the bodies of smug a-holes.
But I mean, you also, when wait, I'm getting an echo. I don't know what's happening.
Perfect.
You also teach your daughter a lesson. I don't know if it was in the same essay or if it was in a different essay about bullying and how to stand up to bullies. And I think that it mirrors that very well, that last interaction where you may not have stood up to the bully, to the terrible person, but a woman did, or
yes.
that person did. And like you're training someone to be that next person to stand up to the bully. And I not I'm not a parent, but Jim and Cliff are. So I saw a lot of inspiration from that interaction with your interaction of raising someone who is going to be that next person.
Well, parenthood is a real trip because like essentially like you kind of like it's very healthy in the way that it removes a lot of the go-to excuses you have for just phoning in doing the right thing, where you're like, oh, my kid's gonna find out about this. Like, oh, my kid's right there. You're like, I might get
Someone's watching
for this, but yeah, like I'm gonna prove a point. We'll just see what happens. Yeah, it has been like one of the greatest values I think of parenthood is that it sort of forces you into a position in which, in order to do your job, you have to at least attempt to walk the walk as you're doing it, and really in the way that habits embed themselves. Eventually that has an impact, and that normalizes itself in your actions and your thoughts and your considerations, even free of being able to prove a point for your child. I'm gonna, I guess, maybe share my screen to offer some visuals as we're discussing some of these contents. Okay, here we go. Okay, so anyway, I think this will flip from slide to slide, but keep on going, y'all.
I'll remind everyone, if you are, for the audience watching, that if you have any comments at any point in time throughout the conversation tonight, type those up because we can ask those to Nate as we go. I will weave them into the conversation.
I'm curious to know how much of the comic life have you exposed the kids to?
Well, we read a lot of comics here in this house, naturally. But I'd say early on, I started reading comics when I was 3. There was a run of Wonder Woman that was my introduction into comics, and I read like 12 issues in a row as a 3 and 4-year-old. But when it came time to kind of transition from board books and picture books into comics, I think I had attempted a couple of books with limited success as a parent. And I was just kind of hanging back. I mean, I guess books by Sarah Verone and Cecil Castellucci, 2 friends of mine, those might have been a nice bridge that were in the comics form, but really read as children's books. For my older daughter, who's 9 now, but I'd say that most of my interactions as a character in Save It for Later involve how I'm, explaining some of these complicated concepts at her level, specifically my older daughter, but as a 4 to 8-year-old. Mm-hmm. So right when my daughter turned 4, that's when she personally requested to start reading March, book 1. And because she was born the week I signed the contract to work on March, literally her entire life has been surrounded by, images of protest, images of John Lewis, images of nonviolent revolution. And so it was something I didn't want to push because I knew that her time would come. And like everybody knows that the thing that a parent tries to get their kids into is going to be the thing they push against. So when she inquired about it, it was an amazing experience, being a comics person, but also being someone who made the book to it sort of forced me into a position where I wasn't reading the book straight. It required me to always have the mindfulness of what the core concepts were and what part of her life had some experience or context for each of those concepts. And if she hadn't really encountered them yet, I would usually, just kind of skip over them and then wait for the next reading. So for a fresh 4-year-old, March book 1 actually worked when, on the first reading, you're really focused on the positive impact of these young people working together for positive social change. And then you're able to fold in, like a 4-year-old has a very clear sense of fairness and injustice, much clearer, I would say, than adults do. And a 4-year-old has definitely already encountered a bully and has opinions about bullies. So a lot, like, that's a direct inroad to talk about power and talk about abuse. But basically, being able to talk about the injustice of bullies with power who use their power to keep things unfair. And then things get more complex and nuanced each time, and talking about, inequality, on the basis of difference itself, and then being able to move from there into the concept, into the concept of racism itself, and then the entire world opens up once you have arrived at a point where a 4-year-old has taken enough of these separate concepts they see in their life, and then suddenly you're talking about racism with a 4-year-old, and it's working. It was just, as a parent, it was just a revolutionary experience to read through the entire trilogy with my older daughter. But that first book in particular, we've probably read like 6 or 7 times, and each experience is different as her worldview rapidly expands.
Well, and Cliff and I were kind of talking earlier today about how when it comes to talking about these sort of bigger things with kids, it's, meeting them on their level. And sometimes it's not easy.
That's right. And sometimes when there just isn't enough context, or when everything is an exception, like in the 3rd chapter in Save It for Later, there's a good component. There's a good chunk in there that talks about policing, about the role of police, and about the context of police in the United States in the 21st century. But also, what's as important is understanding when you're giving your kid too much. And like, sometimes you can just see your kid start to check out. Sometimes you can see the wheels turning, and you realize that you're like 3 steps ahead of them, and you're like, oh, my kid's going to be mulling over this and is going to have a ton of questions tonight, but we can move on tomorrow. And then, like, the bottom line is always like, always be aware that at a certain point, you're just going to wind up scaring your kid, and be like, how do I do the most good? And like, there are a lot of things to be scared about, but understanding when you can do the most good without scaring your kid. So there are times, like when talking about police and power, and how that intersects with racism, there are odd times where I would find myself in the odd for me position of playing devil's advocate for police, like for the existence of the police, because we would have a conversation that got sparked by just driving past a cop that was sitting by a stop sign on their shift, like all cops do, waiting for somebody to run the stop sign. Like my child learning enough, particularly through the pages of March, about, her first experience, I think, with seeing police in action is seeing video of the Bloody Sunday massacre in 1965. For her to process all that and see a traffic cop and be brought to tears and shaking that I was going to get beaten up and thrown in jail by driving past a traffic cop. These are the moments where, you're like, oh, did I mess this one up? And so in Save It for Later, whenever possible, that's where I try to make my own character the idiot or the overreactionary person who really thinks they've got a handle on it, but they don't at all. It's important to recognize that everybody is going to seriously screw up as they're trying to equip young people for their future. And it happens every day.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite and most frustrating parts of being a parent is having to cement all these, really articulate all these things that I think I know or have thought, and trying to impart these ideas onto my son. we had a very similar incident, or not incident, but he used to love to wave to cops because they were nice, and they were, if you walk through downtown, sometimes they're on horses, and after stopping him a few times, because you don't want, what is the perfect balance? You don't want to scare him, you don't want him to be afraid of cops, and you don't want him to run up and hug them all, because
right,
you don't want him to run at them.
I hear that.
Yeah, so it's perfectly articulated in the book, that anxiety of trying not to scare your kid, but also let them know that the world isn't perfect.
Without a doubt. Yeah.
Yeah, Cliff and I have, like, we're kind of our mutual support group at the store. Like, I think I can't tell you how often, like almost every day, we're like, you're not going to believe what my kid did, because they're so similar. They're different ages, but we always seem to have very similar struggles with these kids that are, ages apart, but like so similar.
But yeah, I mean, it helps, just like the fact that, I mean, and this kind of goes back to the main motivation for doing the more memoir focused sections of Save It for Later is just how broadly shared so many of these experiences are, and specifically living through this authoritarian regime and spending at least the next decade fighting like hell to prevent its successful anti-democracy return. I felt like very swiftly, especially with like 100 fires burning at once, and lots of real work to do in the streets and on the phone and on the internet. Very quickly, I feel like there was a perceived loss of bandwidth for airing anxieties, fears, shared experiences, shared doubts, shared rage. If those feelings and emotions and sensations weren't leading to something concrete, and I was like, this is part of the normalization under authoritarianism as well, is we ourselves are doubting the validity of our response to this, the validity of our memories, our experiences, and what we share with each other. This is functioning to keep us divided from each other throughout this experience. And so originally Save It for Later was going to be all memoir, a super raw, personal, quick book. And I was going to try to make it like 96 pages and have it done in 6 months. And I worked very quickly at first. I had almost half of the book broken down, and most of it was focused on those very quiet, subjective, family-centered moments. But as work on that continued, that's when I started About Face. And then at a certain point, I realized that those essay sections and the memoir sections were actually in conversation with each other, and they were working to enrich each other. And then eventually I just had to embrace that this was going to be one book that was a hybrid, that was going to certainly be broader. But, I knew it had to have as much of a laser-like focus as possible. And that's sort of what brought the entire vision together. But it was really primarily motivated by how broadly shared so many of those family experiences and parenting experiences were.
Yeah, it did feel very much like it was capturing living through the past 5 years. I think it was just sort of, if you are a parent of a young child living through all of this, so much of it as I was reading through, I was like, yeah, I remember that feeling, especially the opening chapter about the 2016 election. Because I remember the next day going into work and just seeing how everybody felt. And even over time, everybody talks about how absolutely crushed they felt. And it was so collective and it was so shared, and how everybody was starting to feel this time last year. And just sort of like the deep, the collective trauma that we've all been living through for much longer, but
Yes.
specifically in the past 5 years. And I feel like the book, it really captures that. But at the same time, what I really appreciated about it was it reflects back to you some of the deepest despairs I think a lot of people have felt. But at the same time, it turns it right back around to, this is where, like, we have to get to work if we want to maintain any sense of hope. And it doesn't just leave you with this, it's completely hopeless, because there's a future, and it's our kids, and it's just like the youth that are coming up now. And that was what really resonated with me in the book, because I remember the day, maybe 2 days after the 2016 election, that was when, like, I was pretty down. And then I was like, no, this just means we have work to do. That means that I'm going to have to work just as hard to instill certain values in my kids going forward. And we all have to be Professor X's here. And, teach the next generation of mutants how to hone their powers. So yeah, I'd great job on that.
Well, thank you. And a lot of it also had to do with, like, the older I get, the more I realize that the intergenerational reckoning that would have happened between Generation X and baby boomers, that dynamic that I was a part of, I am now on the other side of it. And the older I get, the more I realize Generation X, generally speaking, has more similarities along specific modes of thinking about our world, has more similarities with baby boomers than with millennials. And one of these, like particularly with white baby boomers and white Generation Xers in America, an overarching assumption of the inevitability of social progress, the concept of things just working out a lot, and it's the kind of thing that's only visible in me once 2016, 17, 18 were rolling around, and having conversations with my parents very early on during the regime, in which I think pre-Charlottesville, my parents still thought I was kind of like off the deep end in kind of like apocalyptic thinking, when I was talking about how this is a fascist movement. Like, fascism isn't the fascism you have in your mind when you think of it, until it gets there. Fascism looks different at the beginning. It looks different in each country. It looks different in each era, with a new set of symbols, a new set of thinking, a new set of scapegoats. But the kind of the mental hurdles that I think a lot of people who were baby boomers were having, in terms of being forced into a position eventually to recognize that the rules did not apply anymore, and that basic assumptions about the functioning of society, the functioning of institutions, every single one of these things either had been thrown out the window or was, under threat of being thrown out the window. And it took a while for my parents and for baby boomers to adjust. And recognizing that in turn, like as my kids grow older, very soon, like my wife and I know that we are on the cusp of being out of touch, and being dinosaurs about something. And when we get called out about something for that first time from our kid, it is time to shut up and listen, because it means that kid is probably right.
I want to get to a couple of questions from the audience, but I also have to ask Nate, are the slides advancing on your screen?
I'm manually advancing them. Are they not advancing?
No.
So it's just been like one page this whole time?
Yep.
Which is, let's just
lovely.
stop sharing then.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought that I heard the clicking, and I was like, I think that something is just not going right. So
Perfect.
yeah.
There we go. Okay. All right.
We'll just
mystery solved.
Yeah.
Thanks for throwing me the lifeline. I appreciate it.
Everyone can just Buy a copy of the book because you will get to see all of the incredible photos that Nate was scrolling through and looking at himself.
Yeah, I was just
yeah.
kind of, gazing over my own work for the last while. Yeah, but go ahead. Yes.
So let's do a couple of questions. The first one we're going to do is from Tyrell. Tyrell is asking, what would you say to parents who feel these type of stories are too much for children?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the answer is yes. This is something that doesn't have a quantifiable answer, but there's like a spectrum in like any kind of heavy real world stuff that is going to be too much. And that's why the important thing is, this is where like I have an advantage because my wife is a child mentor and parenting expert by profession. And so she is my go-to whenever I have doubts and is very good about like gently modeling and calling me out on a lot of this stuff. And it's my job to listen. But yeah, there are a lot of ways in which like, pointing out danger, pointing out like the menace of like the overturning of democracy and like the very real militarized threat of white supremacist, paramilitary groups. That's really intense. And a lot of it is like recognizing that, to a degree, like you can communicate things so that a kid recognizes that it's okay to feel scared about some of this stuff, but also recognizing that your job shouldn't be to scare your kid if you're informing them about some of this truly frightening stuff. And that's where like you can almost immediately tell, I think, if your kid is just like still too young to be asking questions about things they have noticed in their world around them. A lot of it is like speaking for myself, me waiting for my kid to ask me a question. I think that's what really helped me realize that, hopefully if I can pull this off and if I'm doing my job right, I'm coming to them with answers instead of pointing out cracks in a brittle shell of humanity. So yeah, a lot of it is, I think it helps to just be ready for your kid to notice things. And even if they're not asking yet, is like, notice when they're noticing. I think, like kids just really like wear you out and run you down. And it's really easy to like tune my kids out. But, like it takes a while to recognize that like my older daughter is always thinking. And a lot of times, like every kid is different, just like everyone is different. So like, for example, my older daughter saves all of her processing time for, like the last hour of being awake. And it'd be like, do you remember like 3 weeks ago when this happened? I'm like, what? Like, well, I've been thinking about it for these last 3 weeks and I have a lot of questions. It's like, for me, it's really easy for me to be like, oh, I'm ready to go to bed too, man. And be like, no, my kid has been waiting, processing this for weeks. This is where I get to get in the ring. So a lot of it is like, notice when your kid is ready to ask about something. Like I grew up in as like a G.I. Joe kid in a military family during the Reagan era. And so I grew up, like very gung-ho, dressing head to foot in camouflage and wandering around in the swamps of Alabama as an elementary school child. Thankfully, my dad had exercised the same mindfulness with me. And so whenever I would bring up something that was like messed up or inaccurate, or if I had questions about the reality of military service or of violence or use of military force, I now can tell those were the moments where he was like, finally. And he was very patient, but he's like, well, since you asked. And those were the moments that, like really expanded my world and changed my life in a lot of ways. So yeah, just like when your kid asks a question, that's what you've been waiting for.
Yeah. So the next question is from Lauren. Lauren's asking, I love the parenting stories from Nate, and have Cliff or Jim been able to use comics to help explain things to their kids too? And I want to include you, Nate, in this so that it is not just a question aimed at Cliff and Jim. I will not include myself in this because I have nothing to say about this topic. But how do you think that art and comics are a great way to show kids like the world that we live in and a greater understanding of the world that we live in?
To me, the obvious immediate answer to this is that part of the magic of comics as a medium and a language is its ability to automatically foster empathy. And in terms of it versus other storytelling media, I think it has a higher potential to generate empathy in the reader or the viewer than maybe any other mass medium. A lot of this is simply using nonverbal information and cues, and a lot of this is like stuff that I'm not even thinking about consciously when I'm drawing something, but it's part of the camera work and direction and the semiotic choices on the page. But basically, you're nudging the reader in a direction so that they are compelled to put themselves in the shoes of the characters they're reading about. And like there were several like semi-cliche phrases in there. So I want to be very sincere about that. When we talk about this is where I'm conjuring Congressman Lewis here. When we would speak and he'd be like, if you want to tell me that things haven't changed, come walk in my shoes and I will show you change. And that I kind of internalized that with my work on the page in sort of revitalize this notion of placing the reader in someone else's experiences without judgment and sort of trusting the reader to have an experience that was unique. I feel like comics are able to like communicate information textually and in this like fun magical interplay of words and images, but even just free of the text. I think there is a magic and a power in the camera work and the ability of the reader to automatically empathize with the characters they're following from panel to panel. And I think that's one reason why Andrew Iden chose to push for the concept of March as a comic. And that's one reason why March was the success that it was and continues to be. It specifically has to do with the fact that it is a comic and not in some other medium.
Jim?
No, it's true that when using comics for kids, like it was always one of those things where with my son, I never wanted to be like, you're going to be a comics kid. But he started, I am not kidding, started pulling graphic novels off my bookshelf. And so eventually it's like, yeah, we look at comics and he couldn't quite read yet. Now he's a prolific reader and he's almost 5. But there were times where, and it always comes back to X-Men for me, where we're like looking, like he's asking like what it's about, and like, oh, how do you explain the mutant metaphor, and like how Sentinels are an allegory for power and authority and like fear and bigotry, and I just ended up like, those are the bad guys.
Sure.
But there's so much of it that, like with comics, like you were saying, I think a lot of what you can convey in comics that you can't in other mediums is everything kind of becomes a symbol.
Yes.
Like, because it's like a movie and still images, and those still images, a lot of times you want to convey as much, whether it's like motion, emotions, just like what's going on in somebody's mind. Like you slow moments down while progressing a story. And for like kids who read these sorts of things, I think being able to see somebody's expression or standing as a symbol, it helps them get it. Some of that subtext that you were talking about.
I'll save you, Cliff. So we are almost out of time, but I want to remind everyone that we have signed copies of Save It for Later. Jim, Cliff, hold up your copies. That are perfect gifts. I will be gifting one to my brother, who is hopefully watching. But Nate, I was hoping in the very little time that we have left, or however much time honestly, we don't have to have a time limit, but can you, I'm going to put a link in the... There's no time limit.
We all have kids to put to bed here. Come on.
Oh, fine. Okay. I don't have a time limit. Can you tell us, so Run is coming out in August, which is available now for pre-order. I'm going to put a link in the comments right now so that people can pre-order that. But can you tell us a little bit about that book as well?
Yes. Okay. So Run is the successor to March. Run is the last collaboration that we did together with Congressman Lewis, and we started working on it as we were doing March Book 3 back in late 2015, early 2016. Andrew and Congressman Lewis were working up, rough structure and researching and interviewing and scripting, even back as we were completing March, because in a nutshell, Run documents the transition in John Lewis's life from direct action to public service. And the first Run book covers like fall 1965 to summer 1966. It's very different in tone. It's a lot more personal. It's darker, weirder, because life got really weird in 65 and 66, especially, with the rapidly changing relationship of John Lewis to SNCC, the overturning of the chairmanship of SNCC, with Stokely Carmichael assuming control in a very contentious and controversial move in spring of 66. So while we were wrapping up March, we started having these conversations. Like, we have all this stuff that we're really fired up to do, but the tone is very different. We don't know if this is going to be a March Book 4 or if it needs to be its own thing. And ultimately, it came down to Congressman Lewis. He sort of, we all agreed that like trilogies rule, but specifically is like, when I say that, like at the end of March Book 3, he was like, when I say that August 8th, 1965, the signing of the Voting Rights Act was the final day of the movement as I knew it, I really stand by that. Run begins just 2 days later, actually. And so I drew the bridge chapter at the beginning before handing over the primary art duties to Lauren Fury to complete the book. But that it sort of underscored, we're trying to underscore John Lewis's point in that the victories of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 did not actually signal an end of the movement or an end of any work. So historically, the day after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, 25-year-old John Lewis, gets on a plane or a bus or whatever, and he heads down to a small town in Georgia. And then that very next morning, he's protesting and getting arrested with 12 other activists trying to attend a segregated church. While across town at the same moment, there is a fully costumed, hundreds deep Klan rally that starts at the courthouse. But we highlight how the white supremacist right has been paying attention to the tactics and strategies of the civil rights movement, specifically of SNCC and of CORE, and adopting not just shifts in language and tone and rhetoric, but shifts in action on the street. So it gets to be this really disturbing scene where there's this grand wizard sort of coaching these robed Klansmen and hundreds of white supremacists who have gathered, and basically giving them a tongue-in-cheek public nonviolent speech as they march together. And so it signals a real shift in strategies and tactics across the board, and recognizing that protest movements and people's movements can't follow the same patterns multiple times and remain successful. Methods, have to shift and evolve. But also, as we have seen over the past 5 years, we've seen white supremacists and fascists in the United States paying attention to protest movements. I mean, really starting with Occupy, but using a lot of tactics and strategies to their advantage, and using media and social media, patterned after a lot of the early successes on the left. And so it seemed increasingly timely and urgent. But yeah, I'm just really happy that we're able to bring this out into the world. And Congressman Lewis was involved and saw all the pages at some level of development as we were working on it, into 2020.
I cannot wait to read it.
Well, thank you.
So on behalf of Left Bank Books, for Jim and Cliff, I would like to say thank you so much for doing this event with us, for celebrating your new book, Save It for Later. It is really just a fantastic book that the three of us will not be able to stop talking about. So
no, absolutely.
We'll not even try. And I cannot wait to one day have you in our store in person for an event. Hopefully we can make that happen soon.
Count on it. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I've always liked St. Louis. I've been trying to go to the Small Press Expo more often. So I would love to do something in person once we get some semblance of normalcy back in our daily lives. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. And to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in tonight, for joining us for this incredible evening. And we hope to see you again soon. Bye, everyone.